Welcome back to Study Hall, everybody. Today we are going to do a deep dive requested by you, the listener, into a recently signed executive order.
Oh, yeah.
It's called Protecting the American People Against Invasion. And,
Catchy.
right, very catchy. We've got a new administration in office, so,
Yeah.
things are going to change.
Always.
Always. Right. So this is a hard-line stance this administration's taking on immigration. And, there are a lot of potential ripple effects we're going to talk about.
Yeah, for sure.
We're going to talk about, increased enforcement. We're going to talk about sanctuary cities. We're going to talk about the potential economic implications of this thing. So huge topic, lots to unpack.
Yeah, let's get into it.
So the order itself lays out a pretty clear purpose, and it's basically to curb what it calls an unprecedented flood of illegal immigration over the past 4 years.
Right.
And they're, citing concerns over national security, public safety, and, of course, the economic burdens of illegal immigration.
These are the classic talking points.
Right. And so the order is really emphasizing stricter enforcement of existing immigration laws.
Okay.
So we're talking increased detentions, expedited removal processes, all of that.
The whole 9 yards.
Yeah. And what I thought was particularly interesting is that they're establishing these Homeland Security task forces.
Oh, wow.
Right?
The HSTFs.
HSTFs in every single state.
Everywhere.
And they're calling for hiring thousands more immigration enforcement agents.
Wow.
So it seems like a pretty massive mobilization of resources.
That's a big statement.
And then also, the order explicitly revokes several executive orders.
Oh, really?
From the previous administration.
Interesting.
So it's not just about tweaking things here and there.
Yeah.
This is a complete 180.
Yeah, that's a big deal. I mean, what happens when you just reverse course completely on something like immigration policy? Are there going to be unintended consequences?
That's a great question. I mean,
You would think, right?
And to kind of understand this from a legal standpoint, the order cites specific sections of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA.
Right.
And those sections have to do with inadmissible and removable aliens.
Okay.
So they're really asserting their federal authority here.
Makes sense.
And we've also got this other document that's been floating around that outlines some potential pros and cons from sort of a civilian perspective.
Interesting.
And I think it's really valuable to look at these arguments because it kind of shows us how public opinion is being shaped around this.
Interesting.
So from the pro side, from the people that are supporting the order, the potential upsides really center on enhanced national security.
Okay.
They're saying that stricter enforcement is going to deter illegal immigration.
Right.
And it's going to help law enforcement combat cross-border criminal activity.
The drug trafficking, human smuggling, that kind of thing.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And there's this really interesting example
that
I think highlights the human impact of all of this.
Yeah.
The order calls for the reestablishment of the Voice Office.
What's that?
It provides support to victims of crimes that were committed by removable aliens.
Oh, wow.
So it kind of brings it home a little bit.
Yeah, it does.
But, of course, there's always another side to the coin.
Right. What are the downsides to this?
Yeah, what are the potential downsides of increased enforcement? Are there going to be unintended consequences?
Yeah.
And, the cons that are laid out in here are pretty significant. There's the worry about potential overreach and infringement on human rights.
Oh, yeah.
Could these aggressive enforcement tactics actually lead to violations of due process?
That's a good point.
And what about the impact on immigrant communities themselves?
Right.
Will increased scrutiny and fear lead to further distrust in law enforcement?
It could.
And those are big questions.
Huge.
And we can't forget about the economic angle.
Right. The economy.
There are industries like agriculture and construction that rely heavily on immigrant labor. So could these really aggressive enforcement tactics actually lead to labor shortages in these key sectors of the economy?
That's a great question. And that's something we need to think about.
Yeah, this whole thing just feels like this...
It's just a delicate balancing act.
Delicate balancing act, right?
Yeah.
With all these moving parts.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to really understand the impact, we need to zoom in on a few specific parts of the order.
Okay.
There's one that really jumps out at me. It's the one focused on encouraging the voluntary departure of undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, I saw that one too. How does that even work? Are people just going to line up to leave if they've built lives here?
Well, the order says they want to use existing legal mechanisms like expedited removal processes.
Okay.
And they even talk about potential international agreements
Oh, wow.
to like incentivize people to leave.
Interesting.
But will it work? I mean, that's a big unknown.
Yeah. I mean, it makes you wonder what the real intention is here. Is this about facilitating a less disruptive process, or is this just another way to ramp up deportations?
That's a great question. And,
And then there's,
another hot button issue in here is this section on sanctuary jurisdictions.
oh, yeah, that's where things get really complicated.
They do. Can you remind us what sanctuary jurisdictions are and why they're such a point of contention?
So essentially, there's cities or states
Right.
that have adopted policies limiting their cooperation with federal immigration enforcement.
Okay.
So they might refuse to hold undocumented immigrants in jail for ICE,
Mm-hmm.
or they might limit information sharing with federal agents,
Okay.
things like that.
Interesting.
And their argument is often centered around protecting immigrant communities
Yeah.
and, fostering trust between local law enforcement and all residents, regardless of immigration status.
You want everyone to feel safe,
Right, exactly.
reporting crimes, accessing services without fear of deportation.
But of course, the federal government sees this as obstruction,
Of course,
Right.
undermining their authority.
undermining their authority to enforce these immigration laws.
Yeah.
And so this order makes it very clear that this new administration is taking a hardline stance against sanctuary jurisdictions.
Okay.
We're talking about the potential withholding of federal funds
Wow.
and even legal action to force compliance.
Yeah.
And this brings us back to those potential economic implications that we talked about earlier. And this source material that we have really highlights how industries reliant on immigrant labor,
Mm-hmm.
like agriculture and construction, could really be severely impacted by these stricter policies.
Absolutely, if you reduce the workforce.
Right.
Especially in sectors that depend on undocumented labor. I mean, you're likely to see ripple effects throughout the whole economy.
I mean, imagine a scenario
Yeah.
where there are labor shortages leading to production slowdowns, delays in construction projects, rising prices for consumers.
Right.
I mean, that's something that everybody would feel.
Absolutely. That would be huge.
And then on top of all of this, we also have a whole section in the order on recalcitrant countries.
Recalcitrant country.
And it's basically focusing on using sanctions and diplomatic pressure to force other countries to cooperate on accepting deported nationals.
Oh, wow. So this isn't just about what's happening in our borders. It's like trying to influence how other countries deal with immigration, too.
Right, exactly. And it kind of makes you wonder how other countries are going to react to this kind of pressure.
Yeah.
I mean, will it lead to more cooperation, or could it backfire and actually damage international relations?
It's a good question.
There's so many layers to this.
Yeah, we've got a lot to unpack.
We do. So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back in just a minute to dive into some more specifics.
That's good.
All right. Okay, so let's get into some of the more, like the nitty-gritty details of this thing.
Okay.
One of the provisions that really stands out to me is the focus on identifying and registering all undocumented immigrants who are already here in the United States. That's a pretty ambitious undertaking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are they trying to create some kind of massive database? And how do they even think they're going to get people to cooperate, especially with all the fear and distrust that's already out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The order says they're going to launch a public awareness campaign
Okay.
to inform people that they're legally obligated to register and comply with existing immigration laws.
Okay, but let's be realistic here. Are people who are already living in the shadows, potentially fearing deportation, are they really going to come forward and just voluntarily register? It seems like a stretch.
It does. The order does mention exploring ways to encourage voluntary compliance,
Okay.
but they also make it clear that if you don't register, it's going to be a problem. It's going to be a civil and criminal enforcement priority.
So it's like a carrot and stick approach?
Yeah, kind of.
But I still can't wrap my head around how they're going to pull this off. I mean, just the logistics of creating and maintaining a database that huge. And then what about privacy concerns? What about the potential for errors or even misuse of this information? It just seems like it's asking for trouble.
Yeah, I mean, those are definitely valid concerns, and it raises the question of whether this approach is actually going to be effective. Will it actually enhance national security, or will it just drive undocumented immigrants further underground, making them even harder to track?
That's a good point. Okay, so let's talk about another tool in the enforcement toolbox here, the increased use of civil fines and penalties.
Oh, yeah, they're really trying to hit people where it hurts in their wallets.
Exactly. It seems like they're trying to make it financially impossible to be in the country illegally, both for individuals and for anyone who might employ or help them. But again, what about the potential for abuse here?
That's a legitimate concern. Critics are worried that these fines and penalties could be used to target and exploit vulnerable populations, people who are already struggling to make ends meet.
Right? It's like they're already facing the threat of deportation. Now they're being slapped with these huge fines that they probably can't afford to pay.
Yeah, and what happens if they can't pay? Does it lead to even harsher penalties, maybe prolonged detention? The order doesn't really say.
Speaking of detention, that's another area where this order really cracks down.
Yeah.
They're calling for expanding detention capacity and using these facilities to hold people who are apprehended for immigration violations until they figure out what to do with them.
Yeah, and this is where those human rights concerns really come into play. We're talking about potentially detaining thousands, if not millions of people. And many of them might have legitimate asylum claims or strong family ties in the United States.
It's heartbreaking to think about the potential for families being torn apart. And what about the conditions in these detention centers? Are they going to be overcrowded? Are they going to be safe? And the psychological toll of being detained indefinitely. It's just a really tough situation.
And it's expensive. Expanding and containing a detention system that big is going to cost a lot of money. So it raises questions about resource allocation and whether this is really the most effective or humane way to use taxpayer dollars.
Okay, so we've talked about fines. We've talked about detention. What about the actual removal process itself? Does this order change anything in terms of how deportations are carried out?
It does. The order says they want to prioritize the efficient and expedited removal of aliens from the United States. They're trying to streamline the existing removal processes and find new ways to deport people faster.
So basically, they're trying to make it faster and easier to deport people. But doesn't that increase the risk of deporting the wrong people? What about people who have legitimate claims to asylum or other forms of legal protection?
Yeah, that's a huge concern for immigrant rights advocates. They're worried that rushing the removal process could lead to all sorts of problems, separating families, sending people back to dangerous situations without giving them a fair chance to make their case.
It feels like they're putting speed and efficiency ahead of fairness and accuracy. And that's a pretty dangerous trade-off when you're dealing with people's lives.
Right. And there's another thing. The order calls for a review of all federal funding for organizations that provide services to removable or illegal aliens, things like legal aid, healthcare, social support.
So they're basically trying to cut off funding to anyone who helps undocumented immigrants. That seems incredibly harsh.
Yeah, it does. The order says it's about ensuring compliance with existing laws and preventing misuse of federal funds.
Okay.
But critics see it as a way to dismantle the support system for undocumented immigrants, making it even harder for them to get help.
It just seems like this order is creating this climate of fear and uncertainty for undocumented immigrants, making it as hard as possible for them to live here.
I think that's a fair assessment. It's definitely a big shift towards stricter enforcement and a more restrictive approach to immigration. And I think we're going to be seeing the consequences of this shift for a long time to come.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've really spent a lot of time looking at this executive order and trying to understand its potential impact. And it seems pretty clear that this administration is taking a very different approach to immigration than we've seen before, really focusing on enforcement and deterrence.
Yeah, it's a huge shift from what we were seeing with the previous administration. And while the stated goals of, protecting national security and public safety, those are definitely important things.
Of course.
The way they're going about it, the methods they're using in this order, they raise some really serious concerns.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about the potential for overreach and human rights violations and all the unintended consequences that could come from this. Right. It's like they're trying to use a sledgehammer to fix a really complicated problem.
Right. You might make some progress, but you're also probably going to cause a lot of damage along the way. And the thing is, this is just the beginning. Right. This order sets a lot of things in motion, a lot of policy changes and enforcement actions that are going to play out over time. So we can probably expect legal challenges, political battles, and just an ongoing struggle over the direction of immigration policy in this country.
And on all of this, we can't forget about the human side of this. These are real people, real families whose lives are being directly affected by these policies.
Absolutely. We have to consider the human cost, the impact on individuals, families, communities, and just the broader societal implications. This isn't just about abstract legal principles. This is about people's lives.
I think one thing that really stood out to me was the potential impact on trust, both within immigrant communities and between those communities and law enforcement. If people are constantly living in fear of being deported, are they really going to report crimes or cooperate with the authorities?
That's a really good point. Trust is so important for building strong communities and keeping people safe. And when that trust is broken, it can take a long time to rebuild it.
And this whole debate over sanctuary jurisdictions, it really highlights that tension between the federal government's authority and the rights of states and cities to make their own decisions.
It's a classic debate in this country. It goes all the way back to the founding fathers, and it's probably going to keep going on for a long time.
And then there's the economic side of all this. We've talked about the possibility of labor shortages and rising prices and the strain on government budgets. These are all very real consequences that could affect everyone.
The economic impact of this order is going to be huge, and it's going to touch so many different parts of our society. We have to really think carefully about the trade-offs we're making here.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? What should people be thinking about as they try to make sense of this really complicated issue?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Read about this issue from different perspectives and really think critically about the information you're getting. There are no easy answers here. This is a really complex issue with high stakes. We need to approach it with nuance and compassion and remember that we're talking about real people's lives.
It's easy to get caught up in the political back and forth, but we have to remember that behind all the statistics and legal arguments, there are human stories. These are individuals with hopes and dreams and fears, just like everyone else.
I think it's important to listen to the people who are directly affected by these policies, to hear their stories and challenge our own assumptions. This isn't about picking sides. It's about trying to understand the complexities, the consequences, and the human impact of what's happening.
Well said. I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about today. This executive order has really opened up a can of worms. A whole bunch of questions and challenges that we're going to have to grapple with as a society.
Yeah. This conversation about immigration, it's always changing, and this order is just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
So to our listeners out there, keep learning about this issue, keep talking about it, and keep forming your own opinions. It's a topic that deserves our attention and our careful consideration.
And remember, the future of immigration in this country is going to be shaped by the choices we make, the policies we support, and the values we uphold. We all have a part to play in this.
Well, that's it for our deep dive into this executive order on immigration. Thanks for joining us on Study Hall. We'll see you next time.